She screamed at the janitor for touching the baby until the real father walked in. Before we get into it, let's make this moment global. Leave a comment in your own language. Margaret Thompson clutched her 3-month-old daughter Emma closer as she watched the hospital janitor approach her room. Something about the way Daniel Rodriguez looked at her baby made her skin crawl. At 28, Margaret had learned to trust her instincts, especially after everything she'd been through these past few months. "Please don't touch her," Margaret said sharply as Daniel reached toward the baby carrier. "She's sleeping." Daniel's weathered hands froze mid-air, his kind brown eyes reflecting hurt. "I'm sorry, Ma'am. She reminds me of someone I used to know. Beautiful baby." "Well, she's not for strangers to handle," Margaret snapped, immediately regretting her harsh tone but unable to stop herself. The exhaustion of single motherhood, combined with the mysterious circumstances surrounding Emma's father, had left her emotionally raw and defensive. Daniel nodded quietly, returning to mopping the floor around her bed. Margaret noticed how gently he moved, how he seemed to naturally lower his voice near the baby. But fear overrode observation. She'd heard too many stories about hospital staff who got too attached to patients' children. "Nurse," Margaret called out, "can you please make sure the cleaning staff understands they shouldn't interact with my baby?" The nurse, Patricia Williams, appeared with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right, honey? This janitor keeps trying to touch Emma. I don't feel comfortable with it." Patricia glanced at Daniel, who was quietly continuing his work, pretending not to hear. "Daniel's been working here for 15 years. He's harmless, but I'll make sure he knows your preferences." As Daniel finished and wheeled his cart away, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to his interest in Emma. The way he'd looked at her daughter wasn't just casual admiration, it was recognition, almost like he knew something Margaret didn't. Later that evening, as Margaret fed Emma, she found herself thinking about the baby's father. Robert Chen had disappeared from her life the moment she told him about the pregnancy. One day they were planning a future together, and the next, he was gone without explanation. She'd tried calling, texting, even showing up at his apartment, but he'd vanished completely. The mystery of Robert's disappearance haunted her daily. They'd met at a charity gala in November, fallen deeply in love over 3 magical months. And then, nothing. Emma had his distinctive dark hair and almond-shaped eyes, but that was all Margaret had left of him. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Daniel Rodriguez was sitting in his small apartment, staring at a photograph he'd carried for 32 years, a picture of his son Robert, whom he'd given up for adoption as a teenage father. The same son who had no idea his biological father worked as a janitor in the very hospital where his own daughter had just been born. 3 days later, Margaret was preparing to take Emma home when Daniel appeared in her doorway again. This time, he seemed different. Nervous, almost agitated. "Ma'am, I know you don't want me near your baby, but I need to tell you something important," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Margaret instinctively pulled Emma closer. "What could you possibly need to tell me?" Daniel looked around to make sure they were alone, then stepped further into the room. "The baby's father. His name is Robert, isn't it? Robert Chen?" Margaret's blood ran cold. How could this stranger know about Robert? "How do you know that name?" "Because," Daniel's voice cracked with emotion, "Robert is my son." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at this humble janitor, his calloused hands, his worn uniform, his weathered face, trying to process what he'd just said. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Robert would have mentioned. He would have told me about you." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Robert doesn't know about me. I gave him up for adoption when I was 17. His mother, Maria, she was only 16. We were just kids ourselves, working in the fields, no money, no future. We thought we were giving him a better chance." Margaret felt the room spinning. "You're lying. Why would you make up something so horrible?" "I've been looking for him for 32 years, Daniel continued, his voice steady despite his tears. "I hired a private investigator last year when I finally saved enough money. Found out he lived here in Seattle, worked in tech. I've been watching from a distance, too scared to approach him. Then why are you telling me this, instead of telling him? Daniel's shoulders sagged. Because 3 weeks ago, I finally worked up the courage to call him. I told him I was his biological father, that I'd been searching for him. He hung up on me, told me never to contact him again. Margaret felt her world shifting. This explained Robert's sudden disappearance, his complete withdrawal from her life. He'd learned about his biological father right around the time she told him about her pregnancy. He ran away, she whispered, the pieces falling into place. I think finding out about me and then learning about the baby, it was too much for him. I never meant to cause problems between you two. I just wanted him to know that I never stopped loving him, never stopped thinking about him. Emma stirred in Margaret's arms, making soft baby sounds. Daniel's eyes immediately went to her, and Margaret saw it clearly now. The same look Robert used to get when he talked about their future family. She has his eyes, Daniel said softly, and his stubborn little chin. For the first time, Margaret truly looked at Daniel. Beneath the years of hard labor and weathered features, she could see traces of Robert. The gentle way he moved his hands when he spoke, the slight tilt of his head when he was thinking. If you're really his father, Margaret said slowly, then you're Emma's grandfather. The word hung between them, heavy with possibility and pain. Daniel's face crumpled as he nodded, overwhelmed by the reality of having a granddaughter he might never be allowed to know. But Margaret was already forming a plan. If Robert had run because he couldn't handle the truth about his past, maybe it was time someone helped him face it. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks researching everything she could about Daniel Rodriguez. What she found broke her heart and changed everything she thought she knew about family and sacrifice. Daniel had worked 3 jobs to put himself through night school after giving up Robert for adoption. He'd become a certified electrician, then later a maintenance supervisor, before a workplace accident damaged his back and forced him into less physically demanding work. Every extra dollar he'd earned over the decades had gone into a savings account labeled for Robert, money he'd hoped to give his son someday to help with college, a house, or whatever dreams he was chasing. The private investigator's report sat on Margaret's kitchen table, filled with details that painted Daniel not as a deadbeat father, but as a heartbroken teenager who'd made an impossible choice. The adoption agency records showed he and Maria had visited the facility every day until Robert was placed with his adoptive family, the Chens, a loving couple who'd struggled with infertility for years. Margaret held Emma as she read Maria's letter to Robert, written but never sent, found among Daniel's possessions. In it, Maria explained how they'd watched him through the nursery window, how they'd named him Roberto after Daniel's grandfather, how they'd cried for months after the adoption, but never regretted giving him to parents who could provide the opportunities they couldn't. "Your daddy doesn't know any of this, little one," Margaret whispered to Emma. "He thinks his biological parents just threw him away." The more Margaret learned, the angrier she became, not at Daniel, but at Robert's adoptive parents. The Chens had apparently told Robert that his birth parents were young and irresponsible, never mentioning the love and sacrifice behind the decision. They discouraged any discussion of his biological family, creating a narrative that his birth parents had simply abandoned him. Margaret made a decision that would change all their lives. She was going to find Robert and make him understand the truth, not just about Daniel, but about what family really meant. She started with Robert's best friend from college, Marcus Williams, who reluctantly admitted Robert was staying at his cabin in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours east of Seattle. "He's pretty messed up right now, Margaret," Marcus warned over the phone, "finding out about his biological father and then feeling guilty about leaving you and the baby. He's not thinking straight." "Then it's time someone helped him think clearly," Margaret replied firmly. The next morning, Margaret loaded Emma into her car and began the drive into the mountains. She had no idea if Robert would even listen to her, but she knew Emma deserved to know her father, and Robert deserved to know the truth about his own. The autumn colors were brilliant as they climbed into the foothills, and Margaret found herself thinking about how many autumn seasons Daniel had spent wondering about his son, how many birthdays and Christmases he'd marked alone, hoping someday to be part of Robert's life. As they pulled into the gravel driveway of Marcus's cabin, Margaret saw Robert's car parked outside. Her heart raced as she lifted Emma from her car seat. This was it, the moment that would either reunite their fractured family or destroy any chance they had of healing. She walked up to the cabin door, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms, and knocked. When Robert opened the door and saw them standing there, his face went through a series of emotions: surprise, joy, guilt, and fear, all competing for dominance. "Margaret," he breathed, "what are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Robert, about your father, about our daughter, about the truth." Robert stepped aside to let them in, but his body language screamed conflict. He wanted to reach for Emma. Margaret could see it in his eyes, but shame and confusion held him back. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace crackling warmly. Robert had clearly been living rough, unshaven, wearing the same clothes for days, empty takeout containers scattered around the main room. "You look terrible," Margaret said, settling Emma into a portable carrier she'd brought. "I feel terrible," Robert admitted, running his hands through his unkempt hair. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I know disappearing was wrong, but when that man called claiming to be my father and then finding out about the baby, I couldn't think straight." "His name is Daniel," Margaret said firmly. "Daniel Rodriguez, and he's been looking for you for 32 years. Robert's face hardened. "He abandoned me. My adoptive parents told me the truth. My birth parents were teenagers who couldn't handle responsibility. Your adoptive parents lied to you." The words hung in the air like a slap. Robert stared at her, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Margaret pulled out the folder of documents she'd gathered: Daniel's savings account statements, the private investigator's reports, Maria's unfinished letters, employment records showing how he'd worked himself to exhaustion for decades. "Daniel was 17 when you were born. Maria was 16. They worked in agricultural fields 12 hours a day to save money for your future. They visited you every single day in the adoption agency until you were placed. Daniel never stopped looking for you." Robert sank into a chair, the papers scattered around him like pieces of a life he'd never known existed. "This savings account," Margaret continued, pointing to the statements, "he opened it the day you were born. Every extra dollar he earned went into it. There's almost $40,000 in there now, Robert. $40,000 he saved, hoping someday he could help you with college, or a wedding, or buying a house." Robert's hands trembled as he read through the documents. "But my parents said." "Your parents were protecting their own insecurities. They were afraid you'd love your birth parents more than them if you knew the truth." Emma began to fuss, and without thinking, Robert reached for her. The moment his daughter was in his arms, his composure completely cracked. He held her against his chest and sobbed for the father he'd rejected, for the months he'd missed with Emma, for the web of lies that had kept him from understanding what love really looked like. "I hung up on him," Robert whispered through his tears. "He tried to tell me he loved me, and I told him to never call again." "He's not angry at you," Margaret said softly. "He's heartbroken, but he's not angry. He blames himself for everything, for giving you up, for disrupting your life by trying to contact you, for causing problems between us." Robert looked up at Margaret with red-rimmed eyes. "How do you know all this?" "Because I met him. He works at the hospital where Emma was born. He saw her and recognized Robert Chen's eyes looking back at him. He knew who she was. He knew she was his granddaughter the moment he saw her, and I screamed at him for trying to touch her." Margaret's voice broke. "I told the nurses to keep him away from his own granddaughter because I thought he was some creepy stranger." Robert closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the misunderstandings that had torn their lives apart. "What do I do now?" he asked. "How do I fix this?" Margaret moved closer, placing her hand on his arm. We start by going home, together, all three of us, and then you call your father. The word father made Robert flinch, but for the first time since Daniel's phone call, it didn't sound threatening. It sounded like possibility. The drive back to Seattle was mostly silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what came next. Emma slept peacefully in her car seat, unaware that her world was about to expand to include a grandfather who'd been waiting 32 years to love her. When they reached Margaret's apartment, Robert carried Emma inside while Margaret gathered the courage to make the phone call that would change everything. She'd found Daniel's number in the hospital directory, but calling him felt like defusing a bomb. One wrong word could destroy any chance of healing this family. "Daniel," Margaret said when he answered, surprised by how quickly he picked up. "This is Margaret Thompson from the hospital." There was a long pause. "Is the baby all right?" The immediate concern in his voice for Emma broke Margaret's heart all over again. "She's fine. She's perfect. But I need to tell you something. Robert is here with me." She heard Daniel's sharp intake of breath. Did you tell him?" "I told him everything. About the savings account, about Maria's letters, about how you never stopped looking for him. He wants to see you." The silence stretched so long, Margaret thought the call had dropped. Then she heard Daniel crying, quiet, overwhelmed sobs of a man who'd given up hope. "Are you sure?" Daniel finally managed. "Because I can't. I can't handle being rejected again." Margaret looked at Robert, who was holding Emma and staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. "Robert," she called softly, "do you want to talk to your father?" Robert turned, his face pale but determined. He nodded and held out his hand for the phone. Margaret had never heard a more emotionally charged conversation in her life. Two grown men, crying and stumbling over words, trying to bridge 32 years of separation in a 5-minute phone call. "I'm sorry," Robert kept repeating. "I'm so sorry I hung up on you." "No, mijo," Daniel's voice came through the phone, thick with emotion. "I'm sorry. I should have tried harder to find you sooner. I should have fought for you." They arranged to meet the next day at a small cafe near the hospital where Daniel worked. Neutral ground where they could talk without pressure, where Daniel could finally meet his granddaughter properly. That night, Margaret watched Robert pace the apartment, alternating between excitement and terror. He'd called his adoptive parents and had what sounded like a difficult conversation about truth and trust. The Chens were driving up from Portland the following weekend to meet Emma and presumably to face some uncomfortable questions about why they'd hidden the truth about Daniel and Maria. "What if he's disappointed in who I became?" Robert asked for the 10th time. "Robert, you're a successful software engineer with your own company. You're kind, intelligent, and you just became a father to the most beautiful baby in the world. What exactly would he be disappointed about? What if I don't know how to have a father?" The Chens were good parents, but they were formal, reserved. They showed love through providing and achieving, not through, "I don't know how to do this." Margaret sat beside him on the couch. "You don't have to know how. You just have to show up and be honest. That's what Daniel's been doing for 32 years. As they talked, Emma woke up crying. Robert immediately went to her, and Margaret watched as fatherhood seemed to click into place for him. He'd been terrified of the responsibility, but now, holding his daughter while talking about his own father, she could see him beginning to understand the connection between love and commitment that had driven Daniel all these years. "Tomorrow changes everything," Robert said quietly, gently rocking Emma. "Tomorrow fixes everything," Margaret corrected. But neither of them could have predicted what they would learn at that cafe meeting, a revelation that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about their story. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that matched Robert's nervous energy. He'd changed clothes 3 times and was now pacing Margaret's living room while she fed Emma. "He's probably just as nervous as you are," Margaret said, trying to calm him down. "What if this is all too fast? What if seeing Emma makes him feel obligated to be involved when he doesn't really want to be?" Margaret looked at Robert like he'd lost his mind. The man saved $40,000 over 30 years for a son he'd never spoken to. He spent 15 years working at the same hospital, hoping you might someday need medical care there. Does that sound like someone who doesn't want to be involved? At exactly 11 a.m., they walked into Café Luna, a small coffee shop 2 blocks from Seattle General Hospital. Margaret spotted Daniel immediately. He was sitting at a corner table, wearing what was clearly his best shirt and tie, his hands folded nervously in front of him. When Daniel saw them approaching, he stood up so quickly he knocked over his coffee cup. His eyes went straight to Emma, and Margaret watched his face transform with wonder and joy. "She's so beautiful," he whispered, not yet daring to reach for her. "Would you like to hold your granddaughter?" Margaret asked gently. Daniel's hands were shaking as he took Emma, and for a moment Margaret worried he might drop her. But as soon as Emma was in his arms, something magical happened. Daniel seemed to find his center, his nervousness replaced by natural grandfather instincts. "Hola, mi nieta preciosa," he murmured softly, and Emma opened her eyes, staring up at him with apparent fascination. Robert watched this interaction with tears streaming down his face. "She likes you," he managed to say. "She knows family," Daniel replied, never taking his eyes off Emma. "Babies always know family." They talked for 2 hours. Daniel told Robert about Maria, who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, never knowing that Daniel had found their son. He showed pictures of her, and Robert could see his own features reflected in her young face. "She wrote you letters every year. On your birthday," Daniel said, pulling out a small box. "She never sent them, but she never stopped writing them. They're all here." Robert's hands shook as he opened the first letter, dated on his first birthday. Maria's words, written in careful English she was still learning, spoke of hope and endless love for the son she'd given away to give him a better life. But it was Daniel's story that truly broke their hearts. After Maria's death, he'd sold everything he owned to hire the private investigator. He'd taken the job at the hospital specifically because he'd learned Robert lived nearby, hoping against hope that someday Robert might end up there for treatment. "I've been praying for 3 years that you'd walk through those doors," Daniel admitted. "When I saw Emma in the maternity ward and recognized your eyes, it was like God finally answered my prayers." Margaret felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she listened to this man describe a love so pure and patient it defied comprehension. "There's something else," Daniel said quietly, "something I need to tell you both." The change in his tone made Robert and Margaret both sit up straighter. "The private investigator found more than just your address, Robert. He found out why your adoptive parents were so insistent that you never try to find us." Daniel pulled out another folder, this one much thicker than the first. "Your adoptive father, James Chen, he worked for the adoption agency that placed you. He knew Maria and me personally. He knew we weren't irresponsible teenagers. He knew we were desperate kids trying to do the right thing. But he also knew that if you ever found that out, you might want to have a relationship with us." Robert's face went white. "My dad worked for the adoption agency. More than that, he helped arrange dozens of adoptions, always telling the adoptive parents that the birth parents were unfit or uncaring. It made the adoptive families feel more secure, less threatened, but it also meant children like you grew up believing they'd been abandoned instead of loved." The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. His entire understanding of his childhood, his identity, his adoptive parents' motivation, all of it crumbled in that moment. But what Daniel said next would change everything they thought they knew about their story and reveal a connection between their families that went back much further than any of them had imagined. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened the thickest folder. "Your adoptive mother, Patricia Chen, she's not who you think she is either." Robert and Margaret exchanged glances, both bracing for another earth-shattering revelation. Patricia worked as a translator at the adoption agency. She translated for Spanish-speaking birth mothers, helping them understand the paperwork. Daniel's voice grew heavy. "She was the one who translated for Maria during the interviews." "My mother knew your Maria." Robert's voice was barely a whisper. More than knew her. Patricia was there when Maria cried through every interview, explaining how much she loved you, but couldn't provide for you. Patricia saw Maria kiss your baby blanket every day when she came to visit you in the nursery. Margaret felt her heart breaking as Daniel continued. Patricia Chen fell in love with you during those visits. She watched Maria hold you, heard her sing Spanish lullabies, saw her leave little gifts she'd made by hand. Patricia was struggling with infertility, and seeing Maria's love for you made her want you even more. Robert stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. Are you telling me my adoptive parents knew how much you and Maria loved me, and they still told me you abandoned me? The adoption agency had a policy. Clean breaks were supposed to be better for everyone, but Patricia and James took it further. They made sure you'd never want to find us by convincing you we didn't care. Emma started crying, sensing the tension in the room. Margaret automatically reached for her, but Daniel was closer. As he gently rocked his granddaughter, singing a soft Spanish lullaby, Robert saw something that shattered his heart completely. It was the same lullaby his adoptive mother used to sing to him as a child, the same melody Patricia Chen had hummed when he was scared or sick. She'd learned it from Maria and claimed it as her own, never telling Robert it was his birth mother's song. Aurora mi niño, Aurora mi sol, Daniel sang softly, and Robert's childhood came flooding back. Every time Patricia had sung that song, she'd been connecting him to the mother she'd helped him forget. She stole even that from me, Robert said brokenly. My birth mother's lullaby became her lullaby. Margaret reached across the table and took Robert's hand. But now you know where it really came from. Now you know Maria sang it to you first. Daniel pulled out a small, worn music box. Maria bought this before you were born. She wanted you to have something that would always remind you that you were loved, even if she couldn't be with you. The music box played the same lullaby, and inside was a tiny baby photo of Robert, along with a note in Spanish. Daniel translated, his voice breaking. Para mí, hijo querido, you are my sunshine, my moon, my everything. Even if we can't be together, you will always be in my heart. Con amor eterno, tu mamá María. Robert broke down completely, sobbing as he held the music box his birth mother had intended for him 32 years ago. Emma, still in Daniel's arms, seemed to sense her father's pain and reached her tiny hand toward him. She never forgot you, Daniel whispered, not for one single day. Through his tears, Robert looked at his father and daughter, finally understanding the depth of love that had been hidden from him his entire life. But Margaret could see something else building in his expression. Anger, deep, justified anger at the people who had stolen this truth from him. I need to call my parents, Robert said, his voice gaining strength. I need to hear them explain this. But what happened when Robert confronted his adoptive parents would reveal one final secret that would either destroy their family forever or create the most beautiful healing any of them had ever witnessed. Robert's hands shook as he dialed his adoptive parents' number. Margaret and Daniel sat in tense silence while Emma slept peacefully in Daniel's arms, unaware that her grandfather was experiencing his first moments of true family bonding. Mom, it's Robert, he said when Patricia Chen answered. I'm in Seattle with Margaret and the baby, and I'm with my biological father. The sharp intake of breath on the other end was audible even to Margaret and Daniel. Robert, honey, you don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly. Robert cut her off, his voice steady with controlled fury. I understand that you worked as a translator at the adoption agency. I understand that you met Maria, heard her sing to me, watched her leave me gifts, and I understand that you stole her lullaby and pretended it was yours. The silence stretched so long, Margaret wondered if Patricia had hung up. Put Dad on the phone, Robert continued. I want to hear from both of you. James Chen's voice came on speakerphone, defensive and tight. Son, you have to understand, we were protecting you. Those people would have complicated your life. Those people. Daniel's face flushed with anger, but he kept his voice low to avoid waking Emma. My name is Daniel Rodriguez, Mr. Chen. I've been sitting here for 30 minutes, listening to your son learn about the parents who loved him enough to sacrifice everything for his future. Who is this? James's voice turned hostile. Robert, why are you letting strangers manipulate you? This stranger is my father, Robert said firmly, and he's Emma's grandfather. The grandfather you would have kept her from knowing, just like you kept me from knowing him. Patricia's voice cracked as she spoke. Robert, we gave you everything. A good home, education, opportunities. You gave me lies, Robert interrupted. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up believing your birth parents threw you away? Do you understand how that shaped every relationship I've ever had? Margaret watched Daniel's face as he listened to this conversation, seeing him process decades of wondering whether he'd made the right choice. Hearing Robert defend him, claim him as family, was clearly overwhelming. We can drive up today, James said. We can explain everything in person. No, Robert said firmly. I don't want explanations. I want the truth. Did you or did you not tell the adoption agency to make sure my birth parents could never contact me? Another long silence. We wanted to protect our family, Patricia whispered. Your family? What about my family? What about Daniel, who saved $40,000, hoping someday he could help me? What about Maria, who died never knowing if I was okay, because you made sure she could never find me? Daniel's eyes filled with tears, hearing Robert speak Maria's name with such tenderness. And what about Emma? Robert continued, his voice rising. Were you planning to tell her that her grandfather was just some janitor who tried to touch her inappropriately? Were you going to poison her mind against her own family the way you poisoned mine? Margaret had never heard Robert speak with such strength and clarity. Becoming a father had awakened something in him, a fierce protectiveness that extended not just to Emma, but to the family connections she deserved to have. Son, please, James started. Don't call me son, Robert said quietly. You lost the right to call me son when you decided your insecurities were more important than my truth. He hung up the phone and immediately broke down, but this time his tears were different. They weren't tears of loss or confusion. They were tears of liberation. Daniel carefully handed Emma back to Margaret and pulled Robert into an embrace. Father and son held each other for the first time in 32 years, both crying for everything they'd lost and everything they'd finally found. I'm so sorry, Robert whispered against his father's shoulder. I'm so sorry I didn't know, that I couldn't help you, that you went through this alone. You don't apologize for other people's choices, mijo, Daniel replied, using the endearment that felt natural and right. You were a child. You deserved to know the truth, but you were never responsible for finding it. As Margaret watched them, Emma gurgling contentedly in her arms, she realized this was the moment their real story began. Not the story of abandonment and loss the Chens had created, but the story of love that had waited 32 years to be told. But she had no idea that in 72 hours, Patricia and James Chen would arrive in Seattle with a secret of their own, one that would either complete their healing or destroy it forever. 3 days later, Margaret was preparing lunch when she heard car doors slam outside her apartment building. Through the window, she saw Patricia and James Chen climbing the stairs to her front door, looking older and more fragile than she remembered from the photos Robert had shown her. Robert was at Daniel's apartment, helping him sort through boxes of Maria's belongings that Daniel had kept in storage for 5 years. The two men had been inseparable since their reunion, making up for lost time with long conversations that lasted deep into the night. Margaret wasn't sure she should answer the door. Robert had made it clear he wasn't ready to see his adoptive parents yet, but something about Patricia's posture, the way she leaned heavily on James's arm, the careful way she climbed each step, made Margaret reconsider. When she opened the door, Patricia looked up with eyes red from crying. "Please," Patricia said simply. "I know Robert doesn't want to see us, but I need to tell you something about Daniel, about Maria, about why we really did what we did." Against her better judgment, Margaret let them in. Emma was napping, and the apartment felt too quiet as the Chens sat stiffly on Margaret's couch. "You have to understand," Patricia began, her voice shaking. "We weren't trying to be cruel. We were trying to protect Robert from something we thought would hurt him." "By lying to him about parents who loved him?" Margaret's voice was cold. James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Maria didn't just work in the fields. She had a scholarship to the University of Washington. She was pre-med, with dreams of becoming a doctor. Margaret felt her stomach drop. "What?" "Daniel wasn't just a field worker either," Patricia continued. "He was in the ROTC program, planning to join the military and use the GI Bill for college. They were both brilliant kids with bright futures." "Then why did they give up Robert?" Patricia's face crumpled. "Because of us, because of what we told them." The confession hung in the air like poison. "The adoption agency had a policy," James explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were supposed to encourage birth parents to make clean breaks by explaining how difficult it would be for the children to have ongoing contact with birth families. But Patricia and we took it further. We told them Robert would be better off believing he came from a stable middle-class family," Patricia admitted. "We suggested they create a story about being young and unprepared, instead of telling the truth about their academic achievements." Margaret felt sick. "You made them lie about who they were." "We convinced them that if Robert knew his birth parents were educated and ambitious, he might feel like he'd been given away for no good reason. We said it would be kinder if he believed they simply couldn't handle parenthood." The magnitude of this betrayal was staggering. Maria and Daniel hadn't just given up their son, they'd given up their own identities, their own dignity, to protect him from a pain that existed only in the Chens' minds. "Maria dropped out of school," Patricia whispered. "She said she couldn't concentrate on becoming a doctor when she'd given away the person she most wanted to heal." Daniel turned down his military appointment. They both felt like they'd failed at the most important thing they'd ever attempted. Margaret realized the full horror of what the Chens had done. They hadn't just separated a family, they'd destroyed two promising futures based on their own fears and insecurities. "Why are you telling me this now?" Margaret asked. "Because," James said heavily, "Maria tried to contact Robert when he turned 18. She'd finished her degree, finally become a nurse practitioner. She wanted him to know she'd made something of herself, that giving him up hadn't been about inability or immaturity." "What happened?" Patricia broke down completely. "We intercepted the letter. We told the post office to return all mail from her address. We made sure Robert never knew she'd tried to reach out." Margaret stared at them in horror. Not only had they stolen Robert's past, they'd stolen his opportunity to reconnect with Maria while she was still alive. "She tried for 5 years, James continued. "Letters, phone calls to the agency, even hiring a lawyer. We blocked everything." "Does Daniel know this?" "No," Patricia whispered. "And that's what we need to tell Robert." Daniel spent 15 years believing Maria had moved on, forgotten about their son. He never knew she was fighting just as hard to find Robert as he was. The weight of these revelations was crushing. Two people had spent decades in unnecessary pain, believing their child's other parent had given up, when both were desperately searching for the same connection. But Margaret realized this confession wasn't about seeking forgiveness. It was about something much more urgent. "Why now?" she asked again. "Why are you telling me this now instead of waiting to tell Robert?" Patricia exchanged a look with James, and Margaret saw fear in both their faces. "Because Patricia is dying," James said quietly. "And there's something else Robert needs to know before it's too late." Margaret felt the world tilt as James's words sank in. "Dying." Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. I have maybe 3 months." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Despite everything the Chens had done, seeing this woman, who had raised Robert, loved him in her own flawed way, facing death was devastating. "The doctors found it 2 weeks ago," James continued. "That's why we drove up here immediately when Robert called. Patricia needs to tell him something before she can't." Margaret looked at Patricia, seeing her clearly for the first time. The woman was gaunt, clearly in pain, despite trying to hide it. Her hands shook with more than just emotion. "What do you need to tell him?" Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. This was Maria's. She asked us to give it to Robert when he turned 21, but we never did. Inside the box was a simple silver pendant with an inscription in Spanish. Margaret couldn't read it, but she could see it was worn smooth from years of handling. What does it say? "Para mi hijo con amor eterno," for my son with eternal love. Maria wore it every day she was pregnant with Robert. She wanted him to have it, so he'd always know he was loved. Margaret's heart broke all over again. He's never seen this. We told ourselves we were protecting him from painful reminders of the past. But the truth is, we were protecting ourselves from competition we imagined existed. The front door opened, and Robert walked in with Daniel, both men laughing about something Daniel had said. Their laughter died immediately when they saw the Chens sitting in Margaret's living room. "What are you doing here?" Robert's voice was ice cold. Patricia struggled to stand, her frailty evident. "Robert, please, I need to tell you something." "I don't want to hear it. I'm dying, son." The words stopped Robert in his tracks. Daniel immediately moved to Margaret's side, instinctively protective of their newly formed family unit. "What?" James stood and put his arm around Patricia. "Pancreatic cancer, advanced. She has very little time." Robert stared at the woman who'd raised him, anger and grief warring on his face. "So now you want forgiveness because you're dying?" "No," Patricia said firmly. "I want to give you truth because I'm dying, all of it, everything we kept from you." For the next hour, Patricia told Robert everything about Maria's scholarship, about Daniel's military plans, about how they'd convinced his birth parents to hide their true selves, about the intercepted letters, about years of blocked contact attempts. But it was the pendant that broke Robert completely. When Patricia placed Maria's necklace in his hands, he clutched it to his chest and sobbed like a child. "She tried to reach me?" he asked through his tears. "For 5 years after you turned 18, Patricia whispered. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every Mother's Day, she never stopped trying." Daniel's face went white as he processed this information. "Maria tried to contact Robert. She became a nurse practitioner," James told him. "She wanted Robert to know she'd made something of herself, that she was worthy of being his mother." The revelation that Maria had spent years fighting to reconnect while Daniel was also searching devastated him. They'd both been trapped in the same pain, separated by lies they'd never known existed. "I have all her letters," Patricia admitted. "Every one she sent. I kept them thinking, someday, maybe." She pulled out a box containing dozens of envelopes, all addressed to Robert, all returned unopened. As Robert read through them, Margaret watched years of manufactured pain dissolve. These weren't letters from someone who'd abandoned him. They were letters from a mother who'd never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping for a chance to be part of his life. "She wrote about Daniel," Robert said, looking up from one letter. "She says here that Daniel talked about you every day, that he saved every penny, hoping to help you someday." Daniel and Robert looked at each other, both realizing how much unnecessary pain they'd all endured. "I don't know how to forgive you," Robert told Patricia honestly. "But I understand now that you did what you thought was right, even though it was wrong." Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just want you to know that every lie we told because we loved you. We were wrong, but we loved you. What happened next would determine whether this family could heal together, or whether Patricia would die, carrying the weight of her choices alone." Robert set down Maria's letters and looked directly at Patricia. "I need you to do something for me." Patricia nodded, prepared for whatever judgment he might deliver. "I need you to call Daniel Robert's father out loud. I need you to acknowledge who he really is to me." The request seemed simple, but Margaret understood its profound significance. Patricia had spent 32 years referring to Daniel and Maria as those people, the birth parents, anything but family. Patricia looked at Daniel, this weathered man in his janitor's uniform who had loved her son from a distance for 3 decades. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaking, "you are Robert's father. You have always been Robert's father, and I took that away from both of you." Daniel's composure cracked. "Patricia, I don't need—" "Yes, you do," Patricia interrupted. "You need to hear me say that we were wrong, that you were never the threat we made you out to be, that Robert's life would have been richer, not poorer, for knowing you." She turned to Robert. "And you need to hear me say that Daniel Rodriguez is a better father than we ever gave him credit for. 32 years of putting you first, of hoping for your happiness, of working toward a someday that might never come. That's not abandonment, that's love." Robert was crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of a man finally receiving the validation he'd needed his entire life. "There's something else," Patricia said quietly. "Something I need Daniel to know about Maria." Daniel looked up, bracing himself for more revelations. "She never married anyone else. In all the years after Robert's adoption, she never had other children. She told me once, during one of her calls to the agency, that Robert was her only baby, and she couldn't imagine loving anyone else's child the way she loved him." Daniel doubled over as if he'd been punched. "She was alone all those years. By choice," Patricia said softly. "She said Robert was her family, even if she couldn't be with him. She spent her life working with other people's children as a nurse practitioner, but she never tried to replace him. The image of Maria, alone for decades, dedicating her life to healing other people's babies while missing her own, was more than any of them could bear. But Patricia wasn't finished. Wasn't. Daniel, she kept a photo of you in her wallet until the day she died. The same photo from when you were both 17. She told the private investigator she hired that if she ever found Robert, she hoped you'd be part of his life too. She kept my picture. She said you were the only man she'd ever truly loved, and Robert was proof that sometimes love creates something too beautiful to keep for yourself." Margaret watched Daniel process this information, that Maria had loved him until her death, had thought about him every day, had wanted their family reunited just as desperately as he had. Robert stood up suddenly and walked to the window, Emma's soft breathing the only sound in the room. When he turned back, his face was resolved. "Dad," he said, looking directly at Daniel, "I want Emma to know her grandfather. I want her to hear Maria's lullaby, to learn about her grandmother who became a nurse to help other children because she couldn't help her own son." The word "Dad" made Daniel's face light up with joy. "And Patricia," Robert continued, "I want Emma to know you too. I want her to understand that families can be complicated, that people can make terrible mistakes out of love, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to move forward together." Patricia broke down completely. "After everything we did?" "You raised me," Robert said simply. "You weren't perfect parents, but you were my parents. And Emma deserves to know that her daddy had people who loved him enough to make impossible choices, even when those choices were wrong." Margaret realized she was witnessing something miraculous, not just forgiveness, but the birth of a new kind of family, one built not on lies or fear, but on truth and the radical decision to choose love over hurt. But none of them were prepared for what Patricia would reveal in her final confession. A secret that would transform everything they thought they knew about Emma's place in this story. As the afternoon sun slanted through Margaret's apartment windows, Patricia reached into her bag one final time. "There's one last thing," she said, pulling out a manila envelope sealed with tape yellowed by age. "Something I should have given you 32 years ago." Robert looked at the envelope with his name written in faded ink. "What is it?" "Instructions Maria left for your 18th birthday. Not just a letter. Something else." With trembling hands, Robert opened the envelope and found a legal document along with Maria's final letter to him. As he read, his face went through a series of emotions, confusion, shock, and finally, overwhelming joy. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "Maria left me something. She left me a trust fund." Daniel leaned forward. What kind of trust fund? She used her nursing salary to buy life insurance policies, with the payout going into a trust for me when she died 5 years ago. Robert looked up at Patricia with tears in his eyes. The trust matured. There's over $200,000 waiting for me. The room fell silent, except for Emma's gentle breathing. But there's more, Robert continued, reading Maria's letter. She designated it specifically for my future children. She hoped that someday her grandchildren would benefit from the love she couldn't give directly to me. Margaret felt her heart soar. Emma's college education was secured by the grandmother she'd never meet, funded by a love that had transcended death itself. But Daniel was staring at Patricia with a confused expression. You knew about this trust fund? Patricia nodded miserably. The insurance company tried to contact Robert when he turned 25. We told them he'd moved and left no forwarding address. You've kept this from him for 7 years? We were afraid he'd start asking questions about Maria if he received money from her. We thought it was protecting him. Robert set down the legal documents and looked at each adult in the room. His biological father, who'd never stopped loving him. His adoptive parents, who'd loved him imperfectly. Margaret, who'd brought them all together. And his sleeping daughter, who represented the future they were all fighting for. This ends now, he said firmly. The lies, the secrets, the fear. Emma grows up knowing the truth about where she comes from. All of it. The good and the bad and the complicated. He picked up his daughter, who opened her eyes and looked around at all the tearful adults surrounding her. Emma Sophia Rodriguez Thompson, Robert said, giving her the full name that honored all parts of her heritage. You have a grandfather who saved for 30 years to help your daddy's dreams come true. You have a grandmother in heaven who worked her whole life to make sure you'd have opportunities she couldn't give your daddy. And you have grandparents who made mistakes but love your daddy enough to spend their final time together making things right. Margaret watched as Robert carried Emma to Daniel, officially presenting his daughter to her grandfather. Dad, will you teach her Maria's lullaby? Daniel's face radiated pure joy as he took his granddaughter. Aroro mi nieta. Aroro mi sol, he began singing, the same melody that had connected 3 generations through decades of separation. Patricia, despite her pain and exhaustion, smiled through her tears as she watched Daniel sing the lullaby she'd stolen and claimed as her own. It sounds beautiful in Spanish, she whispered. I'm sorry I never let you hear it that way. Margaret realized they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. A family rebuilt, not despite its brokenness, but because of its willingness to face that brokenness together. Over the next 2 months, as Patricia grew weaker, she spent her remaining time telling Robert and Emma stories about his childhood, while Daniel shared memories of Maria and taught Emma Spanish words for grandfather and love and family. When Patricia died peacefully in November, Robert held her hand while Daniel watched Emma in the next room, humming Maria's lullaby. James, broken by grief, but grateful for the reconciliation, asked Daniel if he'd help him plan the funeral. Maria would have wanted you to be family, James told Daniel. She would have wanted us all to be family. 6 months later, on Emma's first birthday, Margaret stood in Daniel's small backyard, watching 4 generations celebrate together. James had sold the Portland house and moved to Seattle to be closer to Emma. Daniel had used part of Maria's trust fund to open a small scholarship program for teenage parents trying to finish school. And Emma, now walking and babbling in both English and Spanish, toddled between her grandfather Daniel and her step-grandfather James, loved completely by everyone who'd learned that family isn't defined by perfection, but by the willingness to choose love over fear, truth over comfort, and forgiveness over pride. As Margaret watched Robert push Emma on the swing Daniel had built, both men laughing as she squealed with delight, she realized their story wasn't really about the painful past at all. It was about the beautiful future that becomes possible when love finally finds its way home.